The committee will come to order. Welcome to the Solving the Climate Crisis: Key Accomplishments, Additional Opportunities, and the Need for Continued Action. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. Statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository to scccc.repository@mail.house.gov. And members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform the committee staff immediately. Before we begin the hearing today, I'd like to take a moment to reflect upon our friend, Representative Donald McEachin, whose untimely death has left a void here in Congress and our committee. Donald was a lifelong public servant. He served the people of Richmond for decades, and here in Congress, he changed the conversation on climate change in critical ways, bringing new voices into the policymaking process, listening to the needs of communities of color, tribes, low-income communities, and other vulnerable Americans. Environmental justice was at the heart of his work. He helped redefine equitable solutions for tackling the climate crisis, and I trust that his example will inspire all of us to be faithful public servants. So let's honor Representative Donald McEachin at this time with a moment of silence. Amen. Well, thanks, everybody. Today, we will examine the historic accomplishments of the 116th and 117th Congresses in tackling the climate crisis and investing in a clean energy economy and a healthy, resilient, and just America. I'll now recognize myself for a 5-minute opening statement. Well, here we are at the end of the 117th Congress, and we can take great pride in our historic accomplishments in spurring the clean energy economy and progress in solving the climate crisis. It is very important that we review our progress and then look ahead to further action. Speaker Nancy Pelosi created our Select Committee at the start of the 116th Congress in 2019 and directed us to develop the policies and innovations needed to tackle climate change. To a member, she appointed climate champions from the Democratic caucus that reflected the know-how and commitment to tackling this enormous task. And we were joined by Republican members interested in solutions. And we got right to work. We followed the science and we bridged coalitions. We channeled the energy of climate protests into meaningful policy. And we built a framework for action that charted a path to net zero. And we helped Congress turn hundreds of solutions into law. From the outset, we've been intensely focused on helping families and businesses across America create good-paying local jobs, slash energy bills, bolster domestic manufacturing, uplift disadvantaged communities, and position America to lead the world in the emerging clean energy economy. We are so proud of our progress. But there is more, much more to do. That's why we've devoted this hearing not just to historic accomplishments, but also to future action as we prepare to release an updated climate crisis action plan to spur further innovation. Our work remains urgent. Climate disasters are putting America's security and stability at serious risk and threatening our economy, our way of life, and our communities. Higher costs, harsh impacts, and greater injury and loss of life are upon us now. This summer, brutal heat waves shattered more than 7,000 daily temperature records across the nation. Persistent drought is drying up our life-giving lakes and rivers, including the vital Colorado River and many of the lakes that support local economies across the West. Wildfires and massive floods are unleashing unprecedented levels of destruction. So are climate-fueled storms like Hurricane Ian, which is now predicted to be the second costliest hurricane in history. Given the growing cost of these catastrophes, House Democrats have used the power of our majority to take bold action to solve the climate crisis. That includes the bipartisan infrastructure law, which makes communities more resilient to droughts, wildfires, storms, floods, heat waves, and other extreme weather events. And it includes our passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the largest clean energy and climate investment in U.S. history. And it puts the United States on a path to reducing heat trapping pollution by roughly 40% by 2030. Our action plan provided a vital roadmap for climate action, and we used every opportunity and every piece of legislation over the past few years to lower cost through cleaner, cheaper energy and to build safer, more resilient communities. Solving the climate crisis is hard work, but the results already are encouraging and the opportunities are exciting. Thanks to our work incentivizing clean technologies, companies in states like Kansas, Kentucky, North Carolina, and Alabama are racing to manufacture the batteries and technologies of the future, creating thousands of jobs along the way. Car manufacturers in states like Michigan and Ohio are investing in our workers as they build electric vehicles that will help reduce pollution. Utilities are increasingly adding cheap wind and solar into their energy mix, lowering costs for consumers and bolstering our energy independence. And we're deploying zero-emission school buses, clean postal trucks, and other clean investments that put families over polluters. Our final majority staff report that we will release next week will look at these key victories and identify new opportunities to meet the goals of our climate crisis action plan. As the 117th Congress draws to a close, it also will serve as a reminder that the fight for climate action must continue. Guided by science, rooted in justice, and powered by American workers. We have a moral obligation to our kids and future generations to continue our work. And I will add with great humility, it's been an honor and a privilege to lead such an impactful committee with an incredibly talented professional staff led by the staff director, Anna Unruh-Cohen. You all have truly made a difference. And I'm grateful to you for answering the call to service to help solve the climate crisis and give our kids a fighting chance for a livable planet. Thank you again. And at this time, I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Garrett Graves. And Garrett, I want to thank you personally and all of the Republican members for your service in this committee. And I trust in future years we will forge some bipartisan work together to help solve the climate crisis and do it in a way that lifts up all communities across this great country. Thank you so much for being my partner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to join you today, and I have also enjoyed the opportunity to work with you over the past few years, and I share your sentiment that this relationship's not over and that we will continue to work on those issues and issue areas where we see eye to eye. I also want to thank Anna and her team. I want to thank Sarah and her predecessors, Marty and Dave, and their team for all the work over the past few years. It's been absolutely extraordinary standing up a new committee with jurisdiction and pulling together all the expertise that's been pulled together. Before I go on to my statement, I lastly just want to recognize Congressman McEachin. I served with him on this committee as well as on the House Natural Resources Committee. And while Congressman McEachin and I candidly didn't always see eye to eye, had a lot of respect for him, for the deep faith that he clearly has, and for the advocacy and issues that he felt so strongly about. No question that it's a loss for this committee, it's a loss for this Congress, and certainly wishing the best for him and his family and his staff, and they're all in our prayers. He was amazing in his strength and bravery and courage as he was dealing with tremendous adversity over the past year or so. Madam Chair, you made a lot of mention of science and data, and I think it's really important. The that I bring up something that I brought up at many hearings, and that's a few jobs back. I was responsible for rebuilding the levees after Hurricane Katrina and rebuilding our coastal wetlands in Louisiana, which were devastated. Some projections, nearly 200 square miles of coastal wetland loss as a result of the 2005 hurricanes that we had. And what we did a few years later is we put together a master plan. And it wasn't the first master plan, but importantly, it was the first resource-constrained master plan. And what I mean by that is that all the master plans before said that we could take the coast of Louisiana and we could sustain effectively the footprint of 2000, the footprint of 1960 or whatever year. The reality is that was impossible. From a resource perspective, from a science, from a technology perspective, it was impossible. So in 2012, we developed the first resource-constrained master plan. How much fresh water do we have in order to sustain the coastal wetlands and the coastal communities? How much sediment do we have in order to rebuild our wetlands and our barrier islands, our dunes? How much financial resources do we have? We can't go out there and go promise people we're gonna have $1 trillion and go sustain the footprint of South Louisiana whenever that number is ridiculous. And so we developed the first resource-constrained plan. And what it did is it actually moved the line further north. So we had folks that we had to tell, look, based on the resources we're aware of, we can't protect you. We offered relocation assistance, we offered elevation assistance, but we had to tell them the truth. And it was that we cannot sustain the footprint based on current resources, current science, current technology. Now, the reason I bring that up is because what's happening right now under all of the various investments, whether it's the IRA, the ARA, the infrastructure bill, $610 billion being set aside, $610 billion being set aside for what is called this energy transition. The problem is no one has done a resource-constrained plan. So we're all being told that we're going to achieve certain emissions reductions. We're all being told that we're going to adopt certain technologies whenever it doesn't take a mathematician, it doesn't take a PhD, it takes somebody who can add and subtract. The resources that we have available cannot achieve the objectives that have been set. Now, let's throw in some curveballs. Where's the next Ukraine invasion going to happen? Is it going to happen in the Congo where you have massive supplies of critical minerals, where we suddenly lose access to that? Oh, but many say, well, what? Well, then what we're going to do is we're just going to produce domestically these resources. Our current regulatory environment can't facilitate the need or the demand for critical minerals that we have today, and are projected to be needed moving forward. Madam Chair, I think it's critical as we move forward. We recognize the fact that the United States has led the world in reducing emissions, that we build on the successes and learn from the failures, and that we ensure that all tools are on the table. As I told President Macron just last week, if we had simply replaced Russian gas with U.S. gas in Europe for 1 year, 218 million tons in emissions reduction. So, Madam Chair, I look forward to working together with you, but I'm going to say it one last time. More science, more data are needed to inform these plans if we're going to realistically achieve targets. Otherwise, all we're doing is misleading the public, and they're going to continue down a path of unaffordability, of undermining energy security, and of record inflation. Yield back.
Thank the ranking member. Without objection, members who wish to enter opening statements into the record have 5 business days to do so. And now I'd like to welcome our witnesses. We have a fantastic panel of witnesses today. First, Alice Hill is the David M. Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment at the Council on Foreign Relations. Her work at CFR focuses on the risks, consequences, and responses associated with climate change. Judge Hill previously served as Special Assistant to President Barack Obama on the National Security Council staff, where she led the development of national policy to build resilience to catastrophic events, including climate change and biological threats. Greg Whetstone is the President and CEO of the American Council on Renewable Energy, ACORE. It's a national nonprofit organization that unites finance, policy, and technology to accelerate the transition to a renewable energy economy. And now I'd like to recognize Congressman Crenshaw to introduce Dr. Foss.
Dan, you're introducing.
Sorry, Kelly Armstrong was talking to me about his new Substack or something. Thank you to all our witnesses for being here. I would like to personally introduce our witness, Dr. Michelle Michaud-Foss. Dr. Michaud-Foss is a fellow at the Baker's Energy Institute in my district at Rice University. She has spent 40 years in the energy industry developing and directing research on energy, value chain economics, and commercial frameworks to support worldwide investment. She is an expert by any definition, and we are very lucky to have her here today. Thank you, Dr. Foss, for joining us. Good to see you again.
Thank you, Mr. Crenshaw. Next, Dana Johnson is the Senior Director of Strategy and Federal Policy at WE ACT for Environmental Justice. There, Ms. Johnson leads the advocacy, regulatory, and policy setting team, helping to shape clean air, healthy homes, water quality, energy democracy, and transportation standards policy. Reverend Dr. Jessica Moorman is a climate and environmental scientist, pastor, educator, and advocate. She serves as the Vice President of Science and Policy at the Evangelical Environmental Network. Prior to joining EEN, Jessica was a AAA Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the U.S. Department of Energy and has conducted climate research at various prestigious institutions, including her alma mater, Georgia Institute of Technology. Brad Markell is the Executive Director of the AFL-CIO Industrial Union Council, IUC. The AFL-CIO is the National Labor Federation of the United States with 58 affiliated unions representing 12.5 million workers. The IUC is the manufacturing arm of the AFL-CIO with 12 unions representing over 1 million members directly in manufacturing. Prior to joining the staff of AFL-CIO, Mr. Markell was an international representative with UAW for 15 years and is a proud member of UAW Local 14 in Toledo, Ohio. Without objection, the witnesses' written statements will be made part of the record. With that, Judge Hill, you are now recognized to give a 5-minute presentation of your testimony. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Chair Castor and Ranking Member Graves. It's an honor to be here before you. I want to congratulate this committee on its extraordinary work. You have brought much needed attention to the risks posed by climate change and identified powerful solutions. With the Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, Congress has made historic investments in both adaptation and mitigation. Once considered a threat for the distant future, climate change has arrived. Americans need only look out their windows to confirm it. Bigger wildfires, heavier precipitation causing rain bombs, deeper droughts, greater temperature extremes, and sea level rise have pummeled all 50 states and the territories. Just yesterday, at the very edge of the Arctic Ocean, in the northernmost community in Alaska, temperatures hit a historic high, 40 degrees, even in the dark of winter. That's 6 degrees higher than the previous record. In late September, Hurricane Ian struck. Its rapid intensification as it approached Florida served as a wake-up call for how climate change can dramatically worsen extreme weather events. Estimates peg overall economic losses from that storm alone at $100 billion. But Hurricane Ian isn't just the latest strain in a string of disasters this year alone. As of October 11th, NOAA estimates that there are 15 separate weather and climate disasters with losses exceeding $1 billion each, and they've battered the United States. Those include a derecho that ripped across states in the Midwest, carrying wind gusts over 90 miles an hour. A storm in May that rained golf ball-sized hail in the Midwest, continuous drought in the western United States, and wildfires in New Mexico, and more. Billion-dollar events are on the rise. 2022 marks the 8th straight year with at least $10 billion weather and climate disasters, according to NOAA. Climate-worsened disasters come not only at a high financial cost, they also take lives, undermine public health, and threaten national security. They inflict misery upon millions. But the United States currently lacks a national strategy to adapt to climate-worsened extremes. The failure to create such a strategy makes us an outlier among developed nations. Without a national adaptation plan in place, our country risks leaving significant climate risks unmanaged. To avoid repeated surprise by the severity and frequency of losses caused by climate-worsened weather, the nation should engage in national planning, including with state, local, territorial, and tribal governments, as well as the private sector. Core elements of any such plan and planning process should include an emphasis on environmental justice, a mechanism to prioritize federal adaptation investments to make sure that the country is spending its limited resources effectively, promotion of cross-border regional and multi-hazard planning, because climate change honors none of the borders that we have so carefully crafted in the last centuries. Because forests, wetlands, marshes, and floodplains protect us, we need to focus on nature-based solutions, and we also must harmonize our climate and mitigation efforts going forward. Similarly, we need, as part of our efforts in the United States, to develop, adopt, and enforce climate-resilient building codes, make better land use choices, have greater consideration, and this is true for many of the states represented here, of the availability and affordability of property insurance as that market is affected, assistance for Americans displaced by climate extremes, and other very important elements. Now is the time to act. We can no longer afford to wait to see what happens. It's up to each of us to move forward. We can't rest on our laurels. There's no time for climate action to slacken. Instead, we must quicken. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Judge Hill. Next, Mr. Whetstone, you are recognized for 5 minutes to present your testimony. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair Castor. Try that again. Thank you, Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and distinguished members of the Select Committee for the opportunity to testify. My name is Greg Whetstone. I'm President and CEO of the American Council on Renewable Energy. I want to take a moment at the outset to convey my deep condolences on the untimely loss of Congressman McEachin. His commitment to the cause of environmental justice is a legacy that we are committed to carrying forward at ACORN. ACORN is the nation's first pan-renewable nonprofit. Working across technologies, our member companies include leading developers, manufacturers, investors, utilities, and corporate off-takers. Last year, our members were responsible for more than 90% of the booming growth in utility-scale U.S. renewable power. We're all about our mission at ACORN, and that is to unite finance, policy, and technology to accelerate the transition to a renewable energy economy. I want to extend ACORN's deep appreciation of the committee for the critical role it has played in defining the nation's climate agenda. In particular, the Select Committee's majority staff report, Solving the Climate Crisis, has provided a roadmap for this Congress. An impressive 305 of the report's recommendations are now enacted into law, a clear testament to the sagacity and lasting impact of the Select Committee's work. Further proof of the committee's influence can be seen in the recently enacted bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, which have enabled historic progress towards our climate objectives. The infrastructure law promotes vital upgrades to the nation's antiquated electric grid. But the biggest gains were in the IRA, which finally positioned the country to get on a climate-safe path. Thanks to the IRA, clean energy businesses will benefit from stable, long-term tax incentives like those enjoyed in the fossil fuel sector for more than a century. Analysts predict that taken together, the IRA's programs will reduce greenhouse emissions in the U.S. by roughly 40% below 2005 levels. With this committee's help, Congress has provided a welcome moment of hope in the face of a climate crisis which, as we just heard, is accelerating faster than predicted, and for that, we are grateful. But how can we ensure that these projections actually come to fruition, and how do we build on this progress to ensure a more climate-friendly future? ACOR has identified several areas for continued oversight and eventual legislation or regulatory action that I will outline briefly here, and I urge the committee to note the greater detail in my written testimony. A critical first step, of course, begins with prompt completion of guidance from the Treasury Department under the IRA. ACOR is pleased to see Treasury soliciting input from diverse stakeholders, and we're encouraged by the guidance we've seen today. The next challenge I'd mention is the effort to catalyze more domestic renewable energy manufacturing and the related effort to accommodate trade policies to the reality that we have no choice but to rely on the global supply chain until we build out our domestic manufacturing base in the renewable sector. I have more detail in my written testimony, but I would mention here that last week's Commerce decision on solar tariffs will further constrain solar panel supply and is not helpful. The next challenge is a big one. Building the 21st century grid, we need to accommodate the clean energy transition and ensure resilience of the nation's electric supply. There is a dire need to expand and update our outdated and balkanized transmission infrastructure. This is a complex area. My written testimony described the several key elements here. And I do want to highlight that there are 3 bills introduced by members of this committee that are relevant. Chair Castor's Efficient Grid Interconnection Act, her Enhancing Electric Resilience Act, and Representative Caston's Reinforcing the Grid Against Extreme Weather Act. Those are important parts of the challenge there. Regarding another important legislative area, ACOR respectfully urges Congress to swiftly pass bipartisan siting and permitting reform with a prominent transmission component. Finally, I want to mention the importance of regulatory action to an effective climate solution. Achieving the emission reduction targets necessary to meet the climate challenge will eventually require steps beyond the IRA's programs. It's my strong belief we will ultimately need regulatory action on climate, and the Clean Air Act provides ample authority in a manner fully consistent with the Supreme Court's recent decision in West Virginia v. EPA. That concludes my oral summary. We face daunting challenges, but prospects for a successful clean energy transition have dramatically improved as a result of your important work. You've given us hope, and for that, we are immensely grateful. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Next, Dr. Foss, you are recognized for 5 minutes. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, Congress members of the committee, and a special thanks to Congressman Crenshaw for the very nice introduction. I appreciate that. I think we all agree that we all want to do the right things. I always start that way in hearings in which I'm asked to testify. The issue is what the right things are, and also discerning all of the trade-offs, being sure that we're not making ourselves worse off in the name of making ourselves better off, and that we are doing everything that we are responsible for doing in full view of all information, fully transparent, and recognizing the pros and the cons and other factors that are involved. I'm not sure that we're there yet on that front. So just a few ideas of concerns that we have, that I have for you all to consider as you go forward. One is the existing arrangement of providing energy, mainly via fossil fuels, for what we all like to think of as the energy, food, water nexus. If we move away from that model too quickly, we're destabilizing all of those arrangements. And we're seeing very troubling signs of this around the world. And that is a very large caution flag for us and how we think about the timing. I think it also raises another issue. We don't want to throw babies out with bathwaters. Fossil fuels are amazing. Hydrocarbons are amazing molecules, and we're learning what to do with those every day. More creative uses, more creative applications, more creative materials, and we need the freedom to begin to continue to experiment with those. When it comes to sources like wind and solar, too many of the costs remain hidden, and it's really not the best way of doing things, especially from a taxpayer customer point of view. One of those realities that is hidden but needs to be better revealed is the relationship between the amount of material that goes into these technologies relative to the energy that comes out. And I recommend to the committee in my testimony that you look at the International Energy Agency's report from last year, the role of critical minerals in clean energy transitions. I was a peer reviewer for that. I included a graphic in my testimony that I think tells the story perfectly. We're trading off lower energy density with higher materials intensity, and we really need to think about the implications of that. I fully agree on issues related to permitting for infrastructure and other things, but it needs to be more broad than simply transmission, because we need to support the base that we've got in place now until we're ready to move on. And I do commend the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which put out a rather provocative report in many ways related to ideas for growing the role of wind and solar, the amount that would be needed in order to achieve any reasonable target, 50%, 100%, and the amount of transmission that would be needed, and the permitting realities associated with that, which they suggest we can solve with nuclear energy, which we are fans of, but that's not an easy thing to do either. So it needs to be on the table. When it comes to the automotive industry and the idea of electrified transmission, a colleague in the automotive industry remarked that retooling an industry that has been the backbone of our manufacturing infrastructure is truly an historic undertaking. And how? And we are not nearly there in terms of achieving the domestic content that is related. I want to refer the committee also to a previous hearing on May 5th that was held by the Committee on Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Energy. And during that hearing, I lined out several concerns about materials supply chains, critical mineral supply chains. And I would have to say that in the intervening year, unfortunately, my concerns have only deepened. We are simply not well prepared to make the obligations that we are discussing today and that are present and in the existing legislation, which raises a question of whether we want to continue to obligate taxpayers when we can't really meet the targets that we're laying out. We have many competing needs for raw materials, of which defense is one, and there are increasing conversations around this. We need to be able to think about all of the physical and electrochemical properties. We need to hold some dry powder aside in terms of budget, because we already have obligated a great deal, and we need to be able to have some in reserve. And then finally, we need to put materials first. Rather than focusing on the end products, think about the supply chains, think about advanced materials in particular. We have a lot of suggestions to make from Rice University and other universities on that front for advanced carbon materials, and especially carbon has value. We need to learn how to reap it and use it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Foss. Next, Ms. Johnson, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you so much to Speaker Pelosi, to you, Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of this committee for responding to the growing threat of the climate crises through the work that you are doing or have done through the Select Committee. I want also to acknowledge the late Congressman A. Donald McEachin. He was a wise and compassionate legislator who cared about the least of these and the climate. We thank him for his leadership of the Environmental Justice for All Act and for standing with communities in pursuit of equitable and just permitting reforms. When I think about the accomplishments of this committee, I am honored that We Act was among the EJ groups asked to participate in solutions-oriented conversations prior to producing the Climate Crisis Action Plan. Considering those most impacted by climate change in your work was important. Thank you. We believe then, as we do now, that this is our time to address climate change and environmental justice. The Climate Crisis Action Plan and your work to operationalize it with policies as well as with funding has been impressive. Thank you. Please know that the people living frontline and fence line to climate and environmental hardships want to see you take action to fix the problems with the deployment of clean energy. But they will ask you to filter your work through the following questions. Are you creating an environment for producing or using energy that will harm communities, perpetuate racially disproportionate climate burdens, and prolong the climate crises? Unfortunately, for us, there are fossil fuel investments in the infrastructure bill and IRA that make it difficult to say no to these important questions. We can also apply this screen to the important work that you are doing to expand our transmission system to increase renewable energy deployment. Energy democracy and a just transition framework are crucial to ensuring an equitable energy transition that centers justice. This won't happen if communities are not at the table, are undermined by conflicts of interest and vapid review processes, or without appropriate legal recourse. So I'd like to share with you some considerations as you weigh options in the remainder of this congressional session, as well as in the future. We know that underfunded and understaffed projects are a major reason for delays. You did the amazing work of ensuring that nearly $1 billion of permitting process funding was included in the IRA. We now have fully funded projects, resources for staff, and investments for modernizing systems and processes. Let's bring them to fruition. Our organization is asking you to unequivocally oppose any side deals and similar proposals. We strongly support the passage of the Environmental Justice for All Act, which is essential legislation to ensure that the clean energy transition centers, protects, and supports communities that have endured decades of fossil fuel pollution. And finally, our organization is a part of a cohort of groups that are working on a set of transmission principles that we believe support clean energy deployment in an equitable way. Broadly, these principles are calling for FERC to promulgate a rule that requires all FERC jurisdictional electric transmission planning processes, provide proactive outreach to and offer meaningful opportunities for affected communities who will be impacted by the proposed line to weigh in on options or solutions and to help guide the planning process. To calculate all the benefits of transmission, including greenhouse gas emissions data. To take into account and minimize siting challenges such as local environmental impacts and impacts on environmental justice in tribal communities. And finally, to ensure that, to the extent reasonably feasible, without impairing its mandate to assess and minimize environmental impacts on EJ and tribal communities, that any proposed transmission solution make use of existing rights of way for any type of infrastructure. We look forward to sharing a detailed version of these principles with you as part of my written testimony and other follow-ups. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Next, we'll go to Dr. Mormon. Welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman Castor. Thank you, Ranking Member Graves, and thank you to everyone on the committee for the opportunity to speak with you today. I want to start by offering my deepest condolences for the passing of Representative McEachin. He was a man of faith with a deep commitment to creation care and giving voice to those disproportionately burdened by pollution. I'm honored to testify today on behalf of the Evangelical Environmental Network and our over 5 million pro-life Christians who've acted with us over the last 5 years for clean air, clean water, and a safe climate. At the Evangelical Environmental Network, we believe all human life is sacred and worthy of protection. We are pro-life from conception to natural death, a theology that we share with the National Association of Evangelicals. As pro-life evangelicals, we have a special concern for children, both born and unborn, and that we believe that we have a moral and biblical mandate to defend the health of all God's children. We want children to be born healthy and unhindered by the ravages of pollution and climate-fueled extreme heat that medical research shows can rob children of their God-given potential before they even breathe their first breath. Simply put, for us, acting on climate and pollution is a matter of life. Now, over the tenure of this committee, we have seen banner year after banner year for transformative policy to defend life from the harmful impacts of climate and pollution. And the majority of these wins were bipartisan. We can look to the Great American Outdoors Act, the Energy Act of 2020, the Congressional Review Act on methane, and the bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS and Science Act. We can even look to key pieces of climate provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act that have origins in bipartisan policy. As we look to the 118th Congress, I sit before you with a very simple message. The work is not done, and we can't afford 2 years of inaction. As a climate scientist, and frankly, as a mother, I believe, like most people in this room, I want to pass down a healthy future and a safe climate to my kids. And I strongly urge the members of this committee to keep the momentum up and continue to work together. For the remainder of my testimony, I'd like to highlight 2 areas that I think are set for strong bipartisan action that I give in detail in my written testimony. First, defending life and wisely stewarding our resources by cutting wasteful methane leaks. And then secondly, harnessing the power of God's creation through natural climate solutions. Cutting wasteful methane leaks from oil and gas production is an incredible opportunity to advance health, quickly reduce climate warming, and reclaim precious natural resources at a time when American families in the world can't afford any wasted drop. Medical research shows that living and working near natural gas and methane production is linked to heart failure, cancer, asthma, birth defects, lower birth weights, all due to pollution from emissions of methane, benzenes, and other toxins associated with production. As an evangelical pastor, I take seriously what the Bible says in Proverbs chapter 13, verse 22, that we are to leave a good inheritance for our children. Birth defects, breathing problems, severe health complications, this is no inheritance to leave. I urge this committee to continue to work to defend health in the lives of over 17 million Americans, including over 3 million children who live, work, or go to school within the half-mile health threat radius of an oil and gas facility. Important investments in the bipartisan infrastructure law and the IRA do this work. However, it puts the onus and burden on the American taxpayer to clean up the messes of industry. In the name of fiscal responsibility, as well as fairness to the American taxpayer, I urge the 118th Congress to work together on common sense oil and gas bond reform to ensure that the full cost of reclamation and remediation is covered. To solve the climate crisis, we also need to harness the power of God's creation and advance natural climate solutions, which according to peer-reviewed research can get us approximately 1/3 of the way towards our carbon reduction goals. America's farmers, foresters, and ranchers are among our most dedicated stewards of God's creation and are a key part of the climate solution. I was just with them, meeting with them in the Midwest this last week, and what I heard is that the IRA's investments in the USDA and Farm Bill conservation programs, that they're critical to making our food producers more resilient to climate-fueled extreme weather, while also building soil health and increasing profitability. They asked that I share that we not cut these provisions in the reauthorization of the Farm Bill because they want to put in place climate-smart agriculture provisions. They simply don't have all the financial support that they need to do that. And so with that, I want to thank the committee for your work. Again, there is much more to be done, And I urge you to continue to work together because our children's health and future depends on it.
Thank you, Dr. Mormon. Next, Brad Markel, thank you for being here. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Castor and Ranking Member Graves, for the opportunity to testify before the committee on behalf of the 12.5 million working people in 58 unions in the AFL-CIO. The climate crisis affects working Americans in nearly every aspect of their lives, and how we respond will shape our lives for the foreseeable future. For many workers, how these changes affect their employment prospects are top of mind. We are beginning to see how investments in new technologies will reshape industries and the impacts on workers and communities. There are a lot of issues in that bucket. Working people and the less fortunate often bear the heaviest burden of the effects of climate change. Fires, floods, droughts, extreme weather, or this year's surprise, to me at least, the Mississippi becoming impassable in certain spots. The effects on families and communities are so massive that in many cases, only government has the scale to address resilience and adaptation, and the public rightly expects government to act. The next Congress should take up that work. I'm going to touch on some recent policy changes that are good for the United States. It's hard to imagine a prosperous America that is not a leader in clean energy technologies across the board. Taken together, the bill, CHIPS, and IRA leverage the U.S. advantage in basic research, fund demonstration and deployment of cutting-edge technologies, and incentivize private investments in clean energy and manufacturing. In 2 short years, the U.S. has fashioned a policy response to climate change that explicitly addresses the challenge posed by China and others that currently dominate clean energy supply chains, and it puts domestic job creation at the center of what it means to be successful in the fight against climate change. That is a win for the American people. But the policies are one thing. We sort of have to convert those policies into wins for jobs and wins for reductions in emissions. It's really important that Congress keep these policies in place so that private capital has the certainty it needs to invest in clean energy at the pace needed to bring emissions down quickly. In the IRA, after all, the heavy lifting is done by tax cuts for investors. Dependence on potential adversaries for new energy technologies would be as risky to the United States as dependence on foreign oil. And increasing domestic capacity to produce these items is the key strategy to reduce that risk. Please don't backtrack. We are on the road to success. We do need to keep moving on accomplishments. Permitting reform is needed. Well, these policies that we've enacted can make us internationally competitive. The evidence is they are already. Investment is pouring in. We still have work to do to make sure that they're brought online quickly and efficiently. Simply put, permitting reform is critical to meeting our climate goals. Although it's an often difficult discussion, we must find ways to permit many more large-scale energy projects than we have in the past. Trade is another important place where we need to keep making policy progress. We still face significant challenges related to our strategic competitors and international trade flows. There is a lot to be discussed here. Maybe we'll get to it, but perhaps the solar industry best represents the industries we face, the issues we face. The global solar industry is hooked on imports from China, but Chinese practices violate our trade laws, and they violate the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act. We cannot blink in this situation. Clear and consistent enforcement of our trade laws, including tariffs where appropriate, is needed to create the conditions for a domestic solar manufacturing industry, from the polysilicon on up. Photovoltaics are poised to become an iconic 21st century industry, and success in the clean energy economy requires that we establish a healthy domestic solar manufacturing industry. To conclude, it's really important to the labor movement that we realize this opportunity, not just to work on climate, but to solve other goals that we have in our economy and our society. It's a profound opportunity to improve fairness and equity, to reverse inequality, to invest in communities that have been lacking job-creating investment for decades, or to invest where fossil fuels will no longer be produced or used. Clean energy investments can more easily be steered to communities of color, creating opportunities with the intent to alleviate the racial disparities in economic opportunities that have plagued our nation. The climate crisis calls for an urgent response, and this is an opportunity to create a cleaner, more prosperous nation. That's what is before us if we're able to seize it. I want to thank the committee for its work toward that goal and for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Well, thank you all very much. And many of you and your organizations have been with us from the beginning as we put out our requests for information, crafted the policies of the Climate Crisis Action Plan, hammered them out into legislation, often bipartisan legislation, for your partnership in working alongside with us. I thank you all very much. So now we'll go to member questions, and I'm going to recognize Representative Brownlee first for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And since this is our last hearing, sadly, I really wanted to thank you, Madam Chair, for your leadership. And your success is, I think, quite clear. Certainly in the 116th Congress, the culmination of a comprehensive report on the climate crisis in the 116th, which I think in essence became the Biden administration's climate policy, and then certainly, as everyone has said today in the hearing, in the 117th Congress, the passing of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, and certainly the CHIPS and Science Bill, all are so critically important to our mission here. And I know it took many, many, many people and much effort to move these bills forward, but you were always at the front of that negotiation, and I just really do appreciate your leadership. And I'm sad, it's been an honor to really serve on this committee, and I'm sad to see it end, but I really recognize your hard work. My first question is to Dr. Moorman, and thank you for your testimony. And I was most interested in, at the end of your written testimony, you talked about and supported the need for the Growing Carbon Solution Act, which is a voluntary carbon trading market to incentivize our farmers, American farmers, to invest in climate-friendly conservation policies. So, and you said that farmers are clamoring for this. And so, if you could talk about that just a little bit more. It's voluntary. Is a voluntary program going to work? Is that what farmers want, is voluntary, or would they rather see something that is more concrete than voluntary, that, takes place really across the country and through kind of all segments of agriculture?
I will tell you that the feedback that we got from the farmers who we met with just last week is they do appreciate voluntary programs.
Dr. Moorman, can you speak directly into the microphone?
Yes.
That would be helpful.
How's that? They do appreciate voluntary programs, but what they're very excited about is the opportunity with the Growing Climate Solutions Act is to get a fair price for sequestering carbon, enriching their soils. And right now, without a verification system, just like we have a verification of USDA organic, USDA certified beef, there's not something like that for the carbon markets, and so it's the Wild West, and they're at risk of not getting a fair price for the good work that they're doing because there's just such a wide range of, there's no standard. And that's what they're really looking for, that standardization, that certainty, that verification. And this is especially important for small and medium-sized farmers who just don't have the resources that the big companies have to negotiate all of those contracts with private companies. And so the USDA plays a really important role of acting as that verifier and certifier. And again, I want to note that this is an act that has strong bipartisan support. It passed in the Senate, and we're poised where we could pass it here in the House by the end of the year.
Thank you very much. You also talked about not enough resources for conservation programs. So do you have a sense of, or do you have any data really about the number of farmers who may be interested in applying for some of these conservation programs but are just not applying because they know the resources are so limited?
So these conservation programs in the Farm Bill and with USDA are consistently oversubscribed. And so one that I heard consistently was the EQIP program, which again is a voluntary program that allows farmers to innovate and trial new things on their farm for 4 years. And according to the Congressional Research Service, the EQIP program is only funding 27% of eligible program applications, so just a quarter of the applications that they get. And this is, again, we see that a backlog in all of the conservation and water programs that are available. And so it's a vast amount of farmers who want to get access but haven't been able to. The provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act of funding these programs is a great step in the right direction, and we need to keep those gains going into the reauthorization of the Farm Bill.
Great. Thank you very much. My time is up and I yield back.
Thank you. Next up, Rep. Crenshaw, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you to the chair and ranking member for holding this hearing. Thank you to the witnesses for coming. I never get to go first, so this is really exciting. Look, we hear again and again about the devastating consequences of climate change, and we have never argued in this committee about whether or not we should address the issue and mitigate the worst outcomes. That we surely agree on, but we do sharply disagree on the solutions. And the argument is made often that only renewables can be the solution. So we're told that we should pursue unreliable energy at a higher cost with severe consequences on our physical environment, or else we don't care enough about climate change. Now, the problem here is that many in the climate movement have endorsed radical environmentalism instead of rational environmentalism, endorsed an emotional approach instead of a fact-based, practical approach. For instance, radicals will reject any measure to reduce the time it takes to build carbon-free energy we need, because we need permitting and regulatory reform. Radicals endorse, somewhat ironically, unprecedented environmental devastation since, of course, the production of renewables requires far more materials and mining of rare earths, far more land to be cleared, and far more transmission lines to actually work. And radicals reject calls to increase the domestic natural gas energy production that will reduce global emissions, because they refuse to acknowledge the fact that more U.S. natural gas on the global market means more foreign coal is displaced, which means emissions are immediately and drastically reduced. This is radical environmentalism. It produces less energy with more resources at a higher cost. To be a radical environmentalist is to ignore goals like adaptation and innovation and instead pursue only prevention, which is an impossible goal. And the irony is that this misguided strategy makes the goal of preventing temperature rises even more impossible than it otherwise would have been. Radical environmentalism is anything but compassionate because the strategy necessarily makes our energy less reliable, which results in poverty, despair, if not outright death. I hear a lot about environmental justice for the disenfranchised, but apparently that doesn't mean justice for them now when they need energy to survive and heat their homes at a price that they can actually afford. And in the next Congress, we will focus on solutions that actually work. Solutions that deliver reliability, affordability, conservation, and a reduction in global emissions. No technology should be taken off the table, and the cost of the solutions should not be greater than the cost of the problem itself. In other words, rational environmentalism. With that, I'll direct my questions to Dr. Foss. Appreciate you being here. Again, good to see you. Should the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act be amended to require a certain threshold of reliability? Do you think that's something we should pursue?
Wow, what an idea. As you well know, Congressman, following our freeze in February 2021 in Texas, where we have an abundance of wind installed capacity and a fair amount of solar now, one of the ideas was to fix a problem that has been around, and it goes directly to your question. The thought is to have the providers of wind and solar energy also execute firm contracts for backup power so that they're properly presenting to the market and to the customer the full cost associated with the use of that energy. And I think that actually there are probably ways of implementing this in a broader way, whether your idea or something like it, but it's of deep concern to everyone as we look at how these resources interact with grids and the challenges in managing them. And what we don't want to do is create money pits around those challenges. We don't want to be constantly spending and trying to solve problems to mitigate all of the consequences of the use of these
Right,
resources.
and related to that, something we've talked about in the past is energy density, right? This is it's an important concept when you're talking about what reliability and energy grids and whatnot. Should that also play a role in determining what energy sources get to produce on federal land? I mean, the reason I bring it up is because according to President Biden's 2050 emission goals, and according to a Princeton study, you'd have to take the equivalent of Arkansas, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and Oklahoma to generate the wind power to contribute to that. I mean, it just seems impossible. And so when we talk about federal land, should energy density also play a part?
Well, I don't know about that. I'd have to think about that as to how it would apply to the federal lands point of view, but it might be part of certification. It might be something that should be implemented as a standard. I certainly think that people should be better educated so they know what we're doing and what the trade-offs are.
It's fundamentally the resources it takes to produce a unit of energy. I mean, that's what we're talking about, and that has to be part of the equation. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Next up, Rep. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5
Thank you.
minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair Castor. And I just want to thank you, as well as our witnesses and the ranking member for the hearing today. But I want to thank you, Madam Chair, and also the Select Committee staff for your great work and tremendous leadership over the last 4 years. It really has been an honor to serve on this committee, and I want to join my colleagues as well in conveying our deep sorrow for the loss of our colleague and friend, Congressman Don McEachin, who was a tireless advocate and as we know, a nationally recognized leader for environmental justice. I represent a district in Oregon, and I was quite moved that in my home state of Oregon, our governor called for the flags to be flown at half-staff in Oregon to remember Representative McEachin. I urge all of us to work every day to honor his memory. We've made meaningful progress in tackling the climate crisis, and I welcome the opportunity to continue working with my colleagues next Congress, although I have to say I'm disappointed that this committee, as we know it, will not continue because I'm proud of the work that we've done with your leadership, Madam Chair. So throughout my work on the Select Committee, as well as on my work on the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, I found it important to emphasize science-based decision-making, which is not radical. It's science-based, and to improve science communication across all pillars of our policy. We know that quality science communication can increase the understanding of how the natural world works. It improves our capacity to make informed decisions here in Congress. And it also helps our constituents and the general public understand the policies and the investments we make and why we make them. So I want to ask you, Reverend Dr. Moorman, can you talk a little bit about why it's important for us to continue these investments to further advance our knowledge and understanding of climate modeling and natural systems, and also how can we work to promote that communication piece, that science communication, both for the public and for scientific communities for the purpose of improving our policy decisions here on the Hill?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And yeah, I just want to iterate that it is really important to continue R&D investment, basic science, research investments for our incredible scientists here in the U.S. We know a lot. We know a lot that we can act on, but as Ranking Member Graves points out, there's still more that we have to discover to be able to put into place climate solutions quickly and efficiently. And so we do need more investments in science, technology, our national labs, our incredible research universities. I'm pleased to say that I got to work for 15 years with them and as part of the Department of Energy as well, and seeing those incredible investments up front. I think the best thing we can do, though, to honor those past investments is also to take what this body of research that we've invested in and begin to put those recommendations into action.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I want to ask a question to Ms. Hill. Thank you for your testimony. Ocean and coastal ecosystems are often overlooked and undervalued. I co-chair the House Oceans Caucus. And I know that they're a tremendous resource. Our natural climate solutions, and this is something I know Dr. Mormon talked about as well, restoring coastal wetlands, protecting blue carbon ecosystems, for example. These can be an essential tool for national, state, tribal governments to meet climate goals. And I've been focusing on the effects of climate change on the ocean and wetlands and calling attention to the benefits of blue carbon. Why is this important from both a domestic and international perspective? And in your work, how are these nature-based projects being used for adapting and mitigating effects? And why is it important for this international collaboration? I mean, the way I look at it, if the ocean covers most of the planet, and if the ocean's not healthy, the planet's not healthy. So how does that intersect with your work on the council?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for your focus on oceans. Absolutely. Oceans are critical to human life, and they are critical for protein for over 1 billion people across the globe. Our fisheries are changing as a result of climate change. Coral reefs are dying, and fish are moving out of areas so that some nations are more harmed than others. This is an international issue. It creates security risks for the United States in that we will see unprecedented numbers of people on the move as a result of climate impacts. Heat, changes to our oceans, more extreme events. It also deeply affects the United States. We have 2 long coasts, and they are part of the economic engine of this country. And to have those coasts battered by more extreme storms, sea level rise, saltwater inundation, the loss of natural wetlands, we are making ourselves highly economically vulnerable, and then we will also see communities forced to leave and find new homes in new areas at great cost to themselves and to other Americans across the nation who need to support those moves. So
Thank you, and I
focusing
see
on
my
our
time is
oceans is
expired.
critical.
Thank you for your response. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Next up, Mr. Palmer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I'll associate myself with the comments about our friend, Mr. McEachin. He was a real gentleman and a serious legislator. He'll be missed, especially by his constituents. Ms. Hill, you talked about golf ball size hail, and that's an example of extreme weather. Would you consider 8-inch diameter hail an example of extreme weather? If you think golf ball that size is, an 8-inch would be a greater example, I would assume. Yeah. Well, I just want to
New trends.
point out that 130 years ago today in Texas, the New York Times reported 8-inch diameter hail. So that was pretty extreme. And you also made this point about people need to just look out their window, as though that looking out your window would be some evidence of climate change. I would say there are people in certain parts of the country this winter that will be looking out their window, thinking about cutting down the trees as a source for heat for their homes because they can't afford their heating bills. We're headed toward a crisis in regard to people being able to afford energy, and it's impacting everything. I mean, it's not just heating your home or filling your tank. It's being able to buy groceries. I've got numerous personal stories here from everything from CNN to the New York Post of people, one in particular, this lady, Philadelphia, who works for Philadelphia's heater hotline, said that as the inflation's pushed up her food budget and other expenses, she's bundling up and keeping the heat turned down, hoping to stretch her heating oil for as long as possible. She said it's miserable. It's like living in an igloo. These are all, I think, directly the result of this administration's energy policy. Here's a guy named Tim Wisely. He says he's keeping it at 50 to 55 degrees in his home. Now, he's older. He said he can't go food shopping and still be able to pay for oil. It's one or the other. And one of the things, and I've expressed this multiple times in this committee, is my concern about excess winter deaths and the impact that's going to have. We've seen it in Europe. Now, there are people who want to deny that. They're excess winter death deniers. that's going to be a problem. This gentleman that I just mentioned, 67 years old, his wife just died. He's living by himself. And you're going to literally have people that are going to have to choose between heating their homes and buying food or buying medicine. And it's a particular concern for people who have cardiovascular issues, respiratory disease, other pre-existing conditions. It's a problem for infants. That the policies of this administration are impacting in a very negative way. Now, I admit the climate's changing. All you got to do, instead of looking out your window, is read the geologic history of the world to know that the climate's changing. But there are also things that are impacting energy production, such as what we've seen in Europe that's going on last year and again this year with falling wind speeds. It requires that the wind speed be at least 11 miles per hour to generate power. It really needs it to be about 15 miles per hour. And when it falls off, you don't get the power generation, and the prices go through the roof. These are some of the things that I think we have to take into account when we're considering these policies, and the rush to renewables, which have already been proven unreliable because they don't provide the consistent baseload that the grid requires, whether you're in the United States or in Europe, is a problem. I think that these are some of the issues that we have to take into account, in addition to some of the things that were mentioned by my colleague, Mr. Crenshaw, in terms of power. I've had numerous discussions about, I think the best way for us to reduce emissions is to go to next generation nuclear. You can site a next generation nuclear facility on 640 acres. That's 1 square mile. To get the same power generation that you would get from a next generation nuclear facility would require 77,000 acres for a turbine farm. That's an ecological disaster, not to mention the mining that it would be required to provide the critical minerals for that. So I just think, and again, I appreciate the opportunity to serve on the committee and to present these perspectives. I do think there's more work to be done, and I appreciate the opportunity to serve with you on the committee, Chairman Castor. I yield back.
Thank you, Rep. Palmer. Next up, Rep. Huffman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses as well. It's been a good conversation. So I am sitting next to an empty place in the dais and a beautiful arrangement of flowers that is a fitting tribute to our dear friend Don McEachin, who we all miss very much. But I want to suggest that an even more fitting tribute to our friend Don, if we love him as much as we say we do, would be to make sure that this week we do not allow the EJ community to be thrown under the bus. We're going to be asked to do that as part of a false choice that suggests that the only way you can have clean energy transmission is to have the biggest rollback of the Clean Water Act in 50 years, to cut the EJ community out of meaningful input in the public process, and to greenlight a whole bunch of terrible polluting fossil fuel projects. We should not do that. We should not do that because it's not the best way to meet our clean energy goals. We should certainly not do it in a dirty deal that's mostly about fossil fuel. So I just want to suggest there's a better way, and we'll have a chance to do that, I think, on the floor this week. But Madam Chair, thanks to you and your staff for these past several years of just doing a great job. It has been a historic year on climate action. Your leadership has helped focus, I think, the country and the world on the climate crisis, its impacts on communities from our lands to the ocean. And we have also, through this committee, done a good job of calling out the fake solutions that are very much part of our challenge as we confront this crisis. We're going to continue to be invited by the fossil fuel industry to pursue fake solutions. We've had a chance to talk very substantively about that. This committee has made clear that the climate crisis is real, and we've approached it with the urgency that it demands. I'm really proud of that. This year, I've been pushing for the need to reform international financial institutions so that we can promote clean energy, not just here, but in countries around the world. That's a very important piece of unfinished business. I've also been highlighting the climate and environmental injustices caused by plastics. As we transition to clean energy for our power sector and our transportation, we need to be prepared for the fossil fuel industry's plan B, which is to push plastics as the next great way to keep us addicted to these planet-killing fossil fuels. But I celebrate all of the achievements that we have been able to notch in this Congress. And as we prepare to hand the majority to our Republican friends, I think we just need to be resolved to continue to point out what unfortunately are some pretty major differences. We're going to see this select committee eliminated right away by our Republican colleagues, and that's really too bad, because I think it shows that as much as they have pivoted from outright climate denial, we still see a stubborn refusal to acknowledge this as the crisis that it is. It deserves a select committee focused on decarbonization and the transition to clean energy, and unfortunately, under the Republican majority, we are not going to get it. I'm also very concerned about the fake solutions that we probably are going to hear way too much about in the years ahead. We don't have time for that. You know, just as the tobacco industry offered us things like filtered cigarettes when the science became totally clear that smoking cigarettes was killing people, we now hear the fossil fuel industry and their allies here in Congress offering us essentially filtered cigarettes. Fossil fuel that somehow here in the US is a little bit less planet-killing than what the Russians put on the market, but it's still killing the planet. We don't have time for fake solutions. We don't have time for filtered cigarettes. And finally, we need to really make sure that we're taking environmental justice seriously, I believe, going forward, because we're going to hear fake equity arguments as well. We have heard time and again in this committee how fossil fuel is actually a great thing for poor people and for disadvantaged communities. And we just need to push more natural gas through projects like the Mountain Valley Pipeline into impoverished areas. We need to listen to the actual frontline communities, not the AstroTurf folks that the industry puts forward from time to time. And so starting with that point, I want to go to Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson, I'm really glad that you brought up the fact that we put $1 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act to streamline transmission and environmental permitting. We all want to see this clean energy deployed as fast as possible. But I want to know if, in the limited time I have left, if you would agree with me that we ought to give that process and maybe the principles you and your EJ colleagues are working on, which sounded very promising, a chance to work before we gut NEPA and the Clean Water Act in the name of clean energy?
Yes, 100% agree with you. We just passed those investments, and as you said, we need to give them opportunity to come into fruition, to be implemented, while we also simultaneously work to make reforms and changes to our permitting process so that we are able to quickly deploy renewable energy. I believe that we can do this with a both-and strategy.
Thank you. And my time has expired, but Madam Chair, I hope I can enter two things into the record. The first is an article in the publication from the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis entitled "Carbon Capture Remains a Risky Investment for Achieving Decarbonization." The second was an op-ed that appeared in August of this year in the New York Times from someone who spent his career in the carbon capture and storage industry and now calls it a scam. The title is "Every Dollar Spent on This Climate Technology is a Waste." Again, both very important to our consideration of fake climate solutions, which we don't have time for.
Without objection. Mr. Armstrong, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's important to reframe a little bit on today's hearing. I don't think the last 2 years have been filled with accomplishments. They've been filled with numerous self-inflicted crises that have made energy more expensive and supply chains more vulnerable. Since January of 2021, President Biden and his administration have canceled the Keystone XL pipeline, issued a moratorium on oil and gas leasing on public lands, pushed radical environmental justice policies that call for the elimination of fossil fuels and baseload power generation, withdrawn documents that provide clarity and streamline the regulatory process, disincentivize the use of natural gas appliances, push for billions in tax increases on domestic energy producers, and propose changes to make it next to impossible to upgrade existing pipeline infrastructure. And that's only a few of the actions taken by this administration that make it harder to domestically produce the energy and raw materials required for daily life. Despite spending trillions of dollars on Green New Deal programs, far too many Democrats refuse to answer the most fundamental questions about where we are going to obtain the components for their fundamental reworking of the American economy. The administration is pushing for 30 gigawatts of offshore wind to be deployed within the next 8 years. How are we going to source all of the raw materials for thousands of turbines without turning to our global adversaries? Democrats are pushing for economy-wide electrification through new standards and requirements. How are we going to handle the grid upgrades required for an unprecedented increase in electricity consumption? There's already a year-long supply chain backlog for essential components like transformers. The majority provided billions through the Inflation Reduction Act for new taxpayer-funded incentives for electrical vehicle purchases. Where are the components going to come from? Automakers have already raised issues with compliance because we don't have the necessary supply chains. And now, when attempting to develop supply chains after the fact, the Department of Energy announced it will provide $200 million to a company whose operations are based in China. Dr. Foss, in your testimony, you noted the important distinction between political timeframes and the reality of existing timeframes. This difference is something I have repeatedly mentioned because there's a substantial disconnect between the policies supported and the realities of the world. All parts of the value chain, from raw material development to infrastructure build-out, take a significant amount of time to develop. Many of the bills pushed by the majority are not sequenced correctly and would create a rush for materials that threaten our economic and national security. Can you expand on statements you've made supporting the pursuit of a materials-first approach to policymaking and the importance of first supporting high-integrity supply chains?
Sure. I think, first of all, it's a recognition of what we're willing to do in the United States and how to change that to persuade people, alter our attitudes, or whatever the case may be. The reality is that the timeframes, the supply chain timeframes are political timeframes, because by the time we work through reviews, all of which are justified, there are legitimate concerns about large-scale projects. I get that. Everybody understands it. We try to work through all of those as fast as we can, and yet on average, it's a 16-year lead time before you actually are bringing material into the market. Globally, it's about the same. So trying to get end products into markets within the timeframes that are specified in legislation, if you can't deliver, means that all you're doing is wasting really valuable resources, taxpayer resources. So that's the concern. In terms of improving sequencing and putting materials first, it's a recognition of that fact. So if you need to do something in the legislation to address it, or something in policy making to address it, it's spending the time to get those foundational tools in place first, and then proceeding with the goals and objectives that you're after.
Does the recent establishment of the state-owned conglomerate China Rare Earth Group impact U.S.-focused materials first supply chain?
Oh, hugely. We're doing a review of that right now. This was a major shift in how things are done. They've consolidated a number of their rare earth enterprises into this very large scale monopoly. China is roughly 80% of the rare earth market. They process 100% of our own production. Rare earth elements are not a huge part of our non-fuel minerals tonnage, but they're critical because of the properties they have. And by doing what they're doing, what the Chinese can do is basically set the terms of the game. And we're quite concerned about that.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Next, Rep. Escobar, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And I want to thank all of our panelists for taking time to be with us today and for all of your great work. Madam Chair, I want to also recognize you and your wonderful leadership. You have steered this ship in such a wonderful way, so inclusive and thoughtful, and I really appreciate your leadership. I've learned so much from it. I want to thank all of my colleagues. I've learned so much from each and every one of you. I know we will all miss Mr. McEachin. It's still hard to understand that he's gone, but he made such an impact on all of us. And I want to thank the advocates watching at home. Your advocacy really helped push this Congress in a powerful way. What we saw over the last 2 years in terms of what we delivered as a result of your work is undeniable. And it's stunning to me that there are folks who refuse to acknowledge the good work. Anyhow, it's been incredible. And I think there are innumerable opportunities ahead. And I'd like to encourage all of our advocates to please not stop pushing on us, not stop holding us accountable, and please continue to use your voices because there is still so much work to do. I represent a community in the Chihuahuan Desert, El Paso, Texas, right on the Rio Grande. And I recently held some really fantastic conversations with agricultural leaders in the community, with county leaders, with leadership from the International Boundary and Water Commission, as well as leadership from the USDA, to talk about the impact that drought has had on the river, and then the subsequent impact that that has on our farmers. We also have regular meetings with our local governments who see what happens when, after severe drought, we get intense rain and the runoff that happens and the incredible damage. And for an economically disadvantaged community like El Paso, those costs are catastrophic on a local community. And so, Ms. Johnson, I'd like to ask you, especially given your work in environmental justice, what are some of do you think, the key aspects of the climate bill, the Inflation Reduction Act that we passed, and potentially also the bipartisan infrastructure law that we passed that could help economically disadvantaged communities like mine the most? And what are some areas where you think Congress has a whole lot more work to do ahead in order to ensure that we build on the good work that we created in the 117th?
Sure, thank you so much for the question. I think that you and your colleagues did an amazing job of pulling together 700 recommendations, policy recommendations for addressing climate and environmental justice. We see those investments being in air pollution, broadly in schools. We see it in emission reductions in the transportation sector, at ports and with clean and heavy duty vehicles. You've made available resources for technical support for frontline groups and others to really get involved in the process of making decisions about climate policy implementation and investment implementation in their communities. And that is quite important. I think one of the ways that you've also made impact to address the questions around affordability issues is that you have increased funding for programs like LIHEAP from $3.8 billion to $4. And I think that that will be an important bridge for individuals as we transition our grid and our energy economy. And I think, as I noted earlier, the work to ensure that we expand transmission opportunities for renewable energy in a way that is respectful and honoring of communities will be vitally important. Communities have to be at the table. Communities need to have substantive environmental assessments, and communities need legal recourse when things don't go as designed. And so I think that as you think about, permitting, as you think about transmission, if you keep those things in mind, that will be vitally important.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Next, Ranking Member Graves, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you. I want to make a few notes in our hearing we had in September. I'm sitting here listening to everyone celebrating the emissions reductions and the successes of the IRA, ARA, IIJA, and other laws that have been enacted in the last year or so. In the September hearing, it was noted that 80% of the emissions reductions were dependent upon a near doubling of the transmission of the electrical grid, a near doubling, an achievement that, let me be crystal clear, will not be achieved, or a goal that will not be achieved. Number two, at that same hearing, a witness testified that approximately 2/3 of the emissions reductions that were cataloged by the EIA were actually projects that were already in the queue, so projects that were already going to move forward. So taking credit for 2/3 of the emissions that were being captured in that legislation in the IRA, these were projects that were already in the pipeline. So look, I think it's really important, and actually, last note, my friend Mr. Huffman was talking about how legislation on the table right now, specifically Senator Manchin's permitting reform, is going to gut NEPA and the environment and all these things. One, I assure you that whoever wrote that hasn't actually been through the permitting process, because that legislation is going to do very little. And I think it's evidenced by the fact that the legislation has 3 tiers. The first tier is it supposedly reforms the regulatory process. Number 2 is it actually sets aside 25 projects that have an expedited process through the regulatory framework. Well, if you fixed it in the first one, why would you need to expedite it in the second one? It doesn't make sense. And then third tier in there is he actually just exempts the Mountain Valley Pipeline project from the regulatory regime that was then improved and then the expedited. So if it's not good enough for Senator Manchin, if it's not good enough for the Mountain Valley Pipeline, why is it good enough for anybody else? So I'm going to say again, Mr. Huffman, that I assure you that folks who are truly looking for regulatory permitting reform will be back to the table, because this isn't going to solve any problems that are relevant. Doctor, I want to make note your maiden name, Michoud, which of course is Louisiana name, and our former Senate President in Louisiana just sent me a text a little while ago. I understand you're cousins, as I suspected. But great to have you with us. Now, all of these strategies to push us in a direction of cleaner energy and renewable energy and lower emissions, they seem to be based on picking technological winners and losers, meaning taking options off the table. I made note earlier of a solution that was taken off the table under this law that would have saved 218 million tons of emissions, would have saved it, would have resulted in the reductions. Can you share perspective on your thoughts on how many of these laws are focusing on technology and even biasing technology to the point to where they wouldn't be remotely economic or affordable without the subsidies, how that plays out long-term as opposed to a strategy that would target emissions reduction?
Okay, trying to give you short answers on this. First of all, let's correct the record. The word renewable is not the right word to describe wind or solar or batteries for that matter. The only way that we are able to use those technologies is with non-renewable materials. A lot of them, as I pointed out, it's the inverse relationship when it comes to energy density. So whether we're getting emissions reductions, to me, is an open question. All we're doing is shifting emissions around because the producers of the components we need aren't subject to the same protocols and the same standards and scrutiny that we are. And this is a fundamental dilemma in the conversation, the global conversation today. And I think even John Kerry has pointed this out, emissions matter no matter where they're produced. And if by accelerating the introduction of technology that creates emissions, especially because it's more materials intense, which by default means more emissions are created, are we really accomplishing what all of you hope to accomplish is very unclear. And one of the real dilemmas in all of this is by giving up the benefits of the fossil fuels we're pushing out of the picture, trading off that energy density, we're actually making ourselves worse off. This is a fair question. It's something that needs to be discussed. If we're
And Dr. Foss, I apologize. I'm out of time, and we've got votes going on, so I want to cut it off. But I just want to, in closing, just make note that based on what you're saying, if renewable energy like wind and solar is truly renewable, then so is oil and gas.
Pretty much.
Because in most cases, you're extracting minerals. Yield back, Madam Chair.
Rep. Caston, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. Thank you to the staff, for everybody. This has been just a remarkable 4 years of work, and I think history will look favorably on us. I also want to say something that has never been said in 4 years on this committee, but I want to close with it. I agree with the ranking member's opening remarks. And specifically when he said that we have to manage for a resource-constrained future. When we were in Sharm el-Sheikh, we had one of the many interesting conversations we had at the last COP, was that if you look at all of the money that the world needs to spend to adapt to a changing planet, whether it's the levees in Mr. Graves' district or investments in Egypt to make sure that the Nile still flows to the people who need it, and all the money we have to invest in mitigation to decarbonize the world, that exceeds all of the money in all of the governments in the world. Mr. Graves is right. We have to manage for a resource-constrained future, and those are horrible choices. The silver lining against that, and I want to come to you, Ms. Hill, with a question in a moment, is that the amount of money required is vastly less than the total amount of money in the world. The beauty of the Inflation Reduction Act was that we pulled private capital along. We didn't assume that you only do this with public dollars. And the way we're going to get there, it's somewhat easier for mitigation. You can make money by building a solar panel that displaces a more expensive energy source. It's a little harder with adaptation, but not impossible, but we can do it. And I think the challenge that we have politically is that politics always favors the haves, as Mr. McEachin always liked to remind us, right? It is, investments in labor productivity are good for consumers, good for the economy, and they're not always great for workers, right? As I think you know, Mr. Martell. Investments in energy productivity are always great for consumers and are not always great for energy producers. And what is as true in Iran as it is in Appalachia is when you subsidize the hell out of fossil fuel extraction, it's really hard to bring capital in to invest in clean energy. And so, and as you mentioned, I mentioned you, Ms. Hill, because you talked about property insurance markets. How do we make sure that we don't distort those capital markets to bring capital forward? How do we make sure that we're investing in the right things, the necessary things, the efficient things, the hard choices Mr. Graves talked about? And how do we make sure that we do that not as quickly as possible, but as quickly as the science demands? So any thoughts you have about how to make sure that as we move forward to embrace cleaner, cheaper, more affordable, more reliable energy, how do we make sure that we bring private markets along and don't hold them back? And if you have any thoughts, and if we have time, would welcome any other thoughts on committee.
Well, thank you for the question. It's a key question because there's not enough money for any government to handle all of the economic costs that come with climate change impacts, the damage, as well as the transition. So we do need to identify ways for capital to be involved in this. I think that one way that could spur this is greater attention from the capital markets regarding the risks that are ahead. The SEC regulation would drive greater focus on that to make sure that it's appreciated, and that will provide opportunities for investment as we're understanding what's ahead. I also think we need to make data available as a public good so that the risks are understood. And then I think the government should be looking at ways to enhance efforts in the private market, such as providing incentives, guarantees to underwrite the kinds of investments that we will need. We have seen some of that in the Inflation Reduction Act, but as you point out, it's very difficult in the adaptation sphere to find that money. But I think if we identified the biggest projects that the United States needs to undertake, we could explore how we'll have public-private partnerships and attract the kind of capital that we need to build those kinds of investments to protect us going forward.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Thanks. I just want to add that there is an important proposal pending at the SEC on sustainability information, climate disclosure that kind of thing can help direct investment in the right way. It is really important to keep in mind that the Inflation Reduction Act really is all about incentives, leveraging private capital. It is not a regulatory program, and it's really a testament to the cost effectiveness of renewable technologies that we can achieve so much progress toward our climate solutions without a regulatory program. And I think those incentives are going to get us off to a very good start.
Well, I appreciate that, and I see we're out of time, but as I've said many times, many of your members, Mr. Westone, are trading at price earnings multiples that are a factor of 10 higher than some of our major oil companies. And if everybody was abandoning Coke for Pepsi, Coke would change their formula, change their price. They wouldn't call up grocery stores and say, "You damn woke capitalists aren't promoting our product that no one wants to buy." And I think we need to be sensitive to that pushback and not get in the way of capital markets. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Mr. Carter, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And let me begin by echoing the comments that have been made by my colleagues earlier regarding Representative McEachin. And I too want to send my thoughts and prayers to the family. And it was an honor to serve with such a great member of Congress. And Madam Chair, if I may, I want to thank you and members of this committee for this work that has been done on this committee. And not the least of which has been the education that all of us have received. I know my colleagues certainly leave with the understanding that Georgia is the #1 forestry state in the country, and that's important for them to remember. So I appreciate that opportunity to share that one last time. Dr. Foss, I want to ask you, some of the legislation that's been passed recently, including the Inflation Reduction Act, that's tried to encourage the adoption of electric vehicles. And in a way, it hasn't fully addressed some of the underlying issues with supply chains. For instance, the tax credits for electric vehicles that were drafted in the IRA required critical mineral sourcing in North America. And while we all agree with that, and we all want that ideally, even the manufacturers have indicated that that's just not going to be possible, and it's going to be a problem. Even our ally, France, President Macron was here last week, indicated that to President Biden as well, that it's a problem. And there was a witness that we had in a hearing in September that indicated that the EV tax credit in the IRA would have almost no impact on EV market uptake. So, it just appears that the adoption, the goal of trying to increase the adoption of EVs in the U.S. and onshore manufacturing is a good goal, but it's not being approached in the right way. And we may fail on both of those because of that. For instance, if I could use the example, the largest investment, the largest economic development project in the history of the state of Georgia was just announced earlier in August in my district, right after this legislation was passed, and that was Hyundai investing billions of dollars, over $5.5 billion in an EV factory in my district, in the 1st Congressional District, that is now jeopardized by the fact that they were not included in the tax credits because of the fact that it'll be a couple of years before they are able to manufacture these cars in the United States. They can't use the ones that they're manufacturing overseas right now, even though they are ally. And again, this is something that President Macron mentioned in his visit with President Biden last week. So I just want to ask you, do you think that, particularly in the IRA, could we have worked with our allies more proactively ahead of time and to ensure some kind of long-term sustainability of our supply chain?
I think you could have. I don't think it would have met your political timeline because those things take a while to hash out. I think we need to give some credit to the auto industry because they are pointing out some of the dilemmas. They are trying themselves to actually rebuild their supply chains, but admittedly, this is not going to fit within any one of your, your goals in terms of when you would like to see these things happen. And you'll simply have unclaimed credits. That is the reality of it.
Well, thank you for mentioning that, because the time frame that you just mentioned is extremely important. This legislation did not go through regular order. It was not vetted as it should have been had it gone through the committee process, and that's one of the biggest problems. I've only got a minute left, so I want to really jump quickly into nuclear power, because I know that you've been an advocate for this and you've spoken on it in previous testimony. We are in the state of Georgia. We have the only 2 reactors under construction, and they're about to go online at Plant Vogtle. And this is going to generate close to $25 billion in economic development and employ over 7,000 workers. Can you talk about what do you feel like is keeping nuclear power from being a larger part of our energy mix? I mean, after all, we all know that it offers us clean, reliable, baseload power.
If I was going to make a recommendation to Congress for something that you all could do beyond this select committee, it would be to revisit the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, how the NRC functions, how it licenses. We have really exciting innovations that are happening on the nuclear front, but the NRC process is not a comfortable one for those.
Good, thank you for that, and I'm out of time, and I'll yield back.
Thank you all. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to begin by expressing my profound appreciation to Chair Castor, to the entire Select Committee staff for their exceptional work over the past 4 years. This committee has played a crucial role in ensuring this Congress centers the climate crisis in everything we do. And thanks to the roadmap that we provided through our 2020 Majority Staff Report, this Congress has been the most consequential in our history in terms of climate action. We shaped and passed transformational policy through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act that will not only help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also grow our domestic manufacturing sector, reduce energy costs, and create good-paying union jobs. We know that clean energy is the future, and by making these investments in climate action, we're not just doing what's needed to protect the health of our planet, but we're also ensuring the United States of America outcompetes countries like China when it comes to the clean energy economy of the future. So while we've made significant progress, I also know that we as a nation have so much more work to do. I was honored when the Speaker named me to the Select Committee because the climate crisis is personal to me. I'm the proud dad of 2 great young children, and I constantly think about the world we're going to leave behind for them and for their children. It's the reason I first ran for office, to make the world a safer, healthier place for them. I know the health of our planet weighs on many young people, just like my kids, just as it does on their parents. In my district, we are seeing record-breaking temperatures year after year. Kids in our communities are experiencing year-round wildfires that threaten to destroy their homes. Just this year, the Laguna Niguel wildfire burned over 200 acres and destroyed at least 20 homes. These same wildfires also dictate how much time kids can spend outside due to air quality concerns, further impacting their everyday life. In my district, kids are also seeing rising sea levels and coastal bluffs that are eroding and have tragically taken lives. We're facing year-round droughts that threaten basic access to clean, drinkable water, and we're confronted with the reality that it'll be increasingly difficult to secure reliable water in the years ahead. This is the result of decades of neglect to protect our planet and a lack of recognition of the impacts of our ongoing climate crisis. When I voted to pass the historic Inflation Reduction Act earlier this year, of which many of the provisions came directly from the Select Committee's work, I knew I wasn't just voting for the biggest investment in climate action in U.S. history. I knew I was voting to create a better world for my kids and for future generations. And while I'm incredibly proud of the work we've done together and the way that this Congress has finally started investing in climate action at a scale matching the challenge that science demands, I am gravely disappointed that Republicans plan to disband this Select Committee. Well, my friends across the aisle, and I often have significant policy disagreements on the best way to protect our planet and grow our clean energy economy, I don't believe that's why they're disbanding the committee. They're choosing the politically expedient option by burying their heads in the sand rather than doing the hard work of proposing policy solutions, working with us to actually tackle the issues with the urgency required. And many, if not all, of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle represent communities that have been devastated devastated by the impacts of the climate crisis, from record-breaking hurricanes and flooding to lethal heat waves, wildfires, and drought. The communities they serve, just like the ones I serve, desperately need this committee to continue its work. So instead of simply disbanding the committee because of the political optics, I offer my friends across the aisle an alternative. Keep the committee, continue our work, and if you don't like the term climate crisis, call it whatever you want. Literally, whatever is most applicable, whatever you decide, whatever you like. But the hearings we've held in this committee, the policy goals that we've outlined, the work that we've done, enacting over 300 of our recommendations, and the remaining recommendations we've yet to enact are all too important to ignore and put to the side for the next 2 years, or worse even, take steps back. There is no other committee in Congress that has such a comprehensive and cross-cutting purview to ensure that climate is considered in all that we do. I urge my friends on the other side of the aisle to reconsider. We must continue to center climate action and advance our clean energy economy. There's simply too much at stake for our planet and the people we're here to serve. And with that, we'll recess until Chair Castor gets back. Thank you.
Committee will come back to orders. One thing about the climate crisis, it really makes you hustle, doesn't it? Thank you all very much, and thank you to the witnesses. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes, and I think I'll use the time also to close out as well. Well, thank you all. You all have marched with us every step of the way, and we're going to need your help and partnership moving on. Greg, thank you very much for kind of framing it in your testimony by recognizing that the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis kind of defined climate policy for the country prior to Speaker Pelosi's vision in bringing us together. There were all sorts of strands of protest, concern, whether it was in health and environmental justice, and clean energy, and from the labor movement. And what we really envisioned happening was bringing everyone together and building the coalition necessary for the most ambitious climate action in the history of the Congress. And with your help, we were able to deliver. Cleaner energy is cheaper energy. And as the world's top scientists tell us, we are running out of time to get this done. So it's with all of your encouragement and partnership that we were able to weave our climate crisis action plan together. And for Ms. Johnson, you know, very early on, we understood that there are many of our fellow Americans who are bearing a disproportionate burden of pollution, of hotter days, of higher bills, and that we have got to focus a lot of the solutions on communities that need to be lifted up. And fortunately, we have a labor movement also, and the workers had to see themselves, had to see a future that was going to be able to provide, in a future where they could provide for their families. And I want to thank Speaker Pelosi for her vision, to all of the climate champions who served here, to the bipartisan work across the Congress, to my Republican colleagues, although every once in a while they made me feel like Jennifer Lawrence or Leonardo DiCaprio and Don't Look Up, because we kept saying, we have to do work now, we have to act now, we have to answer the call to action. And we were blessed with a talented professional staff. And if you are a current staffer on the Select Committee or a former staffer or an intern, would you please stand up so that we can give you a round of applause? You know, I've been around here long enough to know that kind of the daily grind in the Congress sometimes can wear on you. And you just hope that you look back on your days in service here, your public service, and be able to say, you know what, I really made a difference. And the members listened to me, and we were able to build a coalition for action. And when you look at this historic two terms, the 116th, but especially the 117th, in partnership with the Biden-Harris administration and all of the climate advocates there, it does give you hope for the future. I want to thank you all for recognizing our accomplishments, but detailing out what we have to do, a national adaptation plan to address the risks, building a more reliable macro grid and getting clean energy out across the country, the risks of fossil fuel pollution and how that is wearing on us, and making sure we build the capacity in communities, front line and fence line, to make sure that those resources that we have passed in this Congress get to the families and communities that should come first. And that workers continue to lift up, no matter if they're building the clean cars or trucks or the grid or the offshore wind farms, that we do it in a way where we're not just building American and buying American, but it becomes part of the American way of life. A cleaner, healthier, more just, and resilient America. That was our aim, and I want to thank you all for making it happen. Thank you. We're adjourned. I'm going to go run and vote. I think I forgot a couple of words.